Inhumane interrogation has been going on for thousands of years. Ancient Greek scholars told tales of alleged horrible devices created by tyrannical rulers. Confessions could be thrown out if the wrong torture methods were used in medieval times. More torture methods came during the Spanish Inquisition and for witch hunts. Keep watching to learn about ancient torture devices that you'll be glad are not used today. The Iron Maiden. This may be the most famous medieval torture device of all time. The irony of that is it never existed in medieval times. It was an iron coffin with a face. There were spikes inside that would flay the poor victim once they were thrown inside. The Iron Maiden was a hoax created in the 19th century. It was meant to portray the past as a more violent era and the present as more civilized. Johann Philipp Siebenkees is believed to have created it. He wrote about a coin forger in Nuremberg who was forced into one in 1515. Today, Iron Maidens only exist in museums. The rack. This is another famous torture device. It was popular during the Spanish Inquisition and in the Tower of London. Victims suspected of treason or heresy were put on the structure. Yeoman warders who worked on the tower pulled on ropes tied to their wrists and ankles. It stretched their bodies and dislocated their joints. English writer and Protestant preacher Anne Askew is one of the most famous victims. She was put on the rack in 1546 and told to give up the name of fellow Protestant conspirators, but refused. She was burned at the stake but had to be carried to her execution because she couldn't walk. The Scavenger's Daughter. This was another common torture device at the Tower of London. It was used during the 16th and 17th centuries. The metal frame caused victims' bodies to compress in on themselves. It was so powerful they could begin to bleed from their nose, mouth, and other body parts. The Thumbscrew. This is one of the least lethal of all the medieval torture devices, but you'll still be glad they don't use it today because of how painful it was. 2 metal plates and a vise get attached to the thumb. They're tightened more and more with a screw until the victim confesses to whatever crime they supposedly committed. The devices went by other names and spellings, including thumbkins. They were used during Europe's early modern period from 1450 to 1750. Dunking. This torture method was primarily used on suspected witches. They were submerged in water and removed right before drowning. Fear was the key here. Victims never knew when they'd be taken back up to get their breath or if they ever would. The boot. This device was known as the Spanish boot or the scaprins. It had several variations and all of them were terrible. They functioned as a rack for the lower body. The victim's lower legs were put in tight wooden or iron boots. Wooden wedges were placed between the boot and their skin with a mallet driving them in. That caused abrasions, lesions, and broken bones. There were even worse versions that featured spines, nails, or blades. The breaking wheel. Wheels might have been an important part of life in medieval times, but this one was only meant for death. It was also known as the Catherine wheel and used for public executions and torture. The victim's limbs rested between the cogs. The torturer took a hammer and smashed them over the wheel until they died. Their body was then raised on a shaft for all to see. They could also be tied to the outside of the wheel with their feet tied to the ground. The wheel turned until their body broke like a circular rack. The worst part was that the breaking wheel could lead to an agonizingly slow death. Victims could live for several days. Rat torture. This may be the most stomach-churning of all the medieval torture methods. Let's hope you're not sitting down to a meal while you're learning about it. The victim gets tied to a table or rack, a rat's placed on their chest, and a bucket is placed over the poor animal so it can't escape. A fire is then set on top of the bucket. The rat panics. It can't escape, so it does the only thing it can think of. It claws through the human victim it's sitting on top of, often going through their intestines. It's one of the most disgusting torture methods around. It was also long and drawn out, often taking hours for the rat to escape and the victim to die. The Brazen Bull. This ancient torture device is shrouded in myth. It was supposedly first used by Phalaris, the tyrannical ruler of Sicily, in the 6th century BCE. Historian Diodorus Siculus lived 500 years later, but he wrote about them, and Dante referenced them in his famous poem, the Inferno. The story may have been embellished, but it was awful. The life-size bronze bull was hollow inside but had a door on the inside. The victim was shoved in with a fire burning outside. They were routed to death. An acoustic system inside played their screams for everyone to hear, and they sounded like the screams of a bull. The Iron Apega. This is another device with a unique story behind it. Greek historian Polybius wrote about it, saying it was the creation of Spartan King Nebis, ruler from 207 to 197 BCE. He built a robot to resemble his wife Apega, but it was a torture device. Whenever anyone refused to pay him taxes, he allegedly asked them to hug his wife in person. They would go to the robot, which would draw in its arms and crush them with hidden iron hooks. Modern scholars believe the story may have been a myth or allegory. That doesn't make it any less terrifying, though. The Heretic's Fork. The Spanish Inquisition was a high time for torture devices used to elicit confessions. This was one of the most famous. It was engraved with the word abiruo, which is Latin for I recant. The fork had prongs on both ends. It was wedged between the victim's breastbone and throat. They couldn't talk or fall asleep. They fell into a delirious state that often led to a confession from both the innocent and the guilty. The Pear of Anguish. This pear-shaped device was also known as the choke pear. It was used on women who facilitated miscarriages, homosexuals, liars, and blasphemers. It had 4 sharp metal leaves. Those were opened up once it was inserted into the mouth, vagina, or anus to widen it. The pain could rightfully be described as anguish. It wasn't lethal, but it often was followed up by other forms of torture. Scholars aren't sure how effective it was or when it was used. It was originally thought to have originated in the Middle Ages, which ended in 1450. The Judas Cradle. This device, also known as the Judas chair, came from Italy. It had the same focus as the Pear of Anguish, mutilating the orifices. Victims were lowered into the seat with ropes. A point went into their anus or vagina, which was stretched and could be permanently damaged. Rips in the muscle tissue could lead to major infections. Weights were added in certain cases and could cause death by impalement. The Spanish donkey or wooden horse had a similar effect. Victims straddled it and had to place their entire body weight on their crotch. Saw torture. This took the magic trick of sawing a volunteer in half to a whole new level. It was a method of execution rather than pure torture. A saw cut through the victim while they were still alive. They were either cut in half across or along their bodies. Iron chair. This was allegedly a popular form of torture during the Middle Ages. It was the most horrifying version of the Iron Throne from Game of Thrones you could imagine. Victims were put in the middle of the chair. The spikes dug into their flesh as their restraints tightened. The torture could last for hours or days, and death often didn't come until they were released from the chair. Even watching it was enough to force prisoners to confess. Coffin torture. This dreaded torture method was the medieval version of solitary confinement. Victims were stuck inside a coffin and rendered immobile. How long did they have to stay there? It depended on the crime they were being punished for. Blasphemy was punished by death. This was one of many torture methods where victims were put on public display. They would be mocked and abused by locals. Now it's time to hear from you. Do you know of any terrible ancient forms of torture? Let us know in the comments below.